there's the version of Mark and things that I can remember in this lifetime, but then there's the ancestral stuff. And like family constellation work gets into that. Is there ancestral stuff that we have maybe agreed to take on that isn't me, but sort of is me because it's part of me that I'm responsible for? And then when we get into the even deeper metaphysical stuff like past lives and between lives, and I mentioned the University of Virginia before, there's real evidence to suggest that there might be something to this. And to give more weight to that, there are some young children studied at the University of Virginia who have birthmarks and physical defects in their body that align with the way that they talk about having died in the previous life. And the researchers sometimes can find medical records that find like, yeah, this person died in this way. And the deformity you have on your body or the physical defect or something actually correlates very strongly. So if we're talking about personal responsibility, how do we tie that to it? Because maybe it's a continuation of a soul or something, or if it's all simultaneous, we get into language issues of, is there really a past life or simultaneous? But in any event, is there some continuity with you, even though you might not remember everything that happened in the past, that still is responsible, but can't create the causal link for why you're responsible for it?
Well, that makes sense to me. This is why alcoholism, obesity, and addiction runs through multi-generations. Like there's phrases where people say, well, we're the Smiths, we're addicts. I'm just like my dad. Even what I'm asking and what I'm getting at is the way that we use language stems to a belief that's held in the unconscious. And the unconscious, which, you argue that consciousness doesn't happen in the brain. It actually happens outside of the brain. The brain's both a transmitter and consciousness itself. How's that for a paradox? Uh-huh. But the challenging part for me at times is I get so caught up in trying to play the best game that when I experience challenges, I want to go back and connect them to my generation. I want to, at times, blame my mom, blame my dad. The higher version of me, the more expanded thinker in me, with a higher vantage point, can look at that and say, well, that type of thinking just disempowers me. It doesn't actually make me a more powerful guy that can play the game better. So is it really the lens? I mean, look at all the words that are in your books. Is it really the lens of language that shapes our reality? Is that a huge player in our reality itself? The language inside our head with our eyes closed, and the language that I'm projecting onto you that I believe is true in this moment. Is language the ultimate beacon of truth for consciousness? It's
a really big question, because when people come back from mystical experiences, near-death experience or otherwise, psychedelics, often they say, there are no words to describe what I experienced. I can try with language, but it will distort the experience. The term is ineffability. It's like the number one thing in near-death experiences. So these are when a person is almost clinically dead or sometimes clinically dead, and then they're resuscitated and they come back and they have this elaborate experience of expanded consciousness, like sometimes 360-degree vision. Sometimes they were shown visions of the future that turned out to be true. Sometimes they actually saw things from above their body that are validated when they're resuscitated. So verified memories and during an out-of-body experience. So crazy stuff. And they'll say consistently, it's ineffable. I can try to use words, but if you haven't experienced this, you're not even gonna know what I'm talking about. So it gets to challenges with the nature of consciousness itself. Can we use words to describe the nature of reality if the reality is consciousness? So we're dealing in approximation. The word's always gonna approximate what's going on. And how much is that distorting experience? And yet at the same time, we need to communicate. And yet at the same time, when I, like in my book, An End to Upside Down Contact, we don't have it here, I evaluated allegations of contact with non-human intelligences, whether in a near-death state or these quote-unquote UFO states that have been reported throughout history. Often what happens is that the beings people encounter do not use words. They say it's telepathic communication. And yet the communication was clear. It was mind to mind. Because it's a reasonable question to say, if you encountered a being, how did you communicate with them? Did they have the same language? And people will say consistently, telepathic. So what does that tell us about the nature of reality, but also communication? Maybe we're doing an efficient form of communication as humans.
Oh, I would say we definitely are. The majority of communication, and this is like, hopefully I live to 100. That's my goal, right? So I'm approaching midlife. And what I notice is that I spent about 40 years communicating in a very disempowering way. I would use words like kinda, maybe, I'll try. I might do that. Yeah, let me see. I mean, the language that we're all taught through societal example and even parental example, and forgive them, like many people just don't know, they don't know. It's unconscious incompetence. But what I'm getting at, it goes back to my question for you about language and the structure of reality through language. The big piece for me has just been learning how to speak in a very loving, empowering, and respectful way, and also being a unique ego who's Josh, right? With his amalgamation of what he's learned and what he thinks is true. Do you ever struggle with that as a writer? Because whether it's the boardroom and financials, taking massive complexes and breaking them down to things that can be digested, or being on a podcast talking about 7 books all at once, which is why I wanted to talk about liberty and thinking out of all 7. Do you struggle with that? The way that you articulate thought in relation to explaining consciousness?
I struggle with the possibility that I could mislead someone. I really don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. And because of that, I end up not having definitive conclusions. And I actually start my latest book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, dedicating it to those who are comfortable with 3 important words. I don't know. So being super clear on that, because sometimes things can get taken out of context where it's like, Mark, you claimed this. But actually, if you saw the bigger context, actually, I was just trying to explain something a certain way and I had to approximate and I had to use an analogy. So that is a challenge that I always face because people can interpret things the way they want to.
So if we're really talking about thinking, then really what that is at its core, it's the ability to perceive ideas or to understand ways of being, ways of speaking, what our environment is showing us, what our visual cortex is showing us. What is thinking at its core? Like, there's even the thinking man, I believe it's in Rome or some really amazing country. I think, therefore I am. But just the thought of thinking does not mean that you're free, because thoughts are like just information. They're leaves floating out, and it's only when we attach emotion to a thought that it starts to become real. What actually is thinking? If we're going to know the right side and the upside, what is thinking in its own way?
Yeah, this is another one of those, I don't know. I don't know exactly what it is, but we know we experience thought. And this gets in the realm of such abstract stuff because a brain, for example, we could dissect it in science and actually point to different parts of the anatomy. But a thought, can we do the same thing? I can't sit there and point to your thoughts, but you're experiencing them and so do I. I know I'm experiencing a thought and I know that there's a sense of an I that can register the thought. So we start to get really meta when we break down our own consciousness because there's an I that experiences the thought. So there's a distinction between self and thought. That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
But what is it and where is it coming from? And can we control it? I know there are hypotheses on this stuff, but I really don't know.
If you love that video, you'll love the one on the screen right now. Click the one on the screen and enjoy.